afternoon, everybody. A very, very warm welcome today to this session on Is the International System Equipped to Manage Climate Risk? This is a session co-organized by E3G in Chatham House. And this is a discussion, as you can surmise from the title, about climate risk management international system. It is part of the London Climate Action Week, which is a whole series of events happening this week. And there should be a link to some of the other events taking place as well. This is also the occasion of the launch of a new paper written by Chatham House and E3G, which is called Climate Risk Management for International Organizations, Ideas for Improving Strategic Planning. Again, you should have received this in your invitation, but hopefully one of my colleagues is posting a link at the moment to the paper in the chat as well. I'm just reading out my notes right now. This makes me smile because my colleagues who were prepping me for this session said it is a pretty dry title for what is actually a super interesting and important issue, which I actually have read and agree, not least because it's extremely critical that we are looking at how well international organizations are equipped to manage climate risk in this day and age, which is going to be the focus of our discussion today. As we know, climate change is calling for rethinking and reconfiguring of many of our normal assumptions, including our institutional dynamics, which is why how international organizations are responding to and incorporating climate risk management is a key part of our future. Now, please note that this session will be recorded and will be made available, so it is on the record. What we will do today, to start with, is that Ollie Brown will give us a 10-minute summary of the main findings of the research. He is an associate fellow with Chatham House, but he has been working for UNDP, DWPA, and most recently also as a strategic planner for the United Nations Environment Programme as well. After Ollie gave us a summary of these main findings of the research, which as promised is extremely interesting, we will then turn to three great panelists to kick off a discussion today. And I'll introduce them more fully before they speak later, but in brief, they include first Andrew Harper, who is Special Advisor on Climate Action to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva, and hurrah to Switzerland last night, and Jonathan Howard, who is the Chief Risk Officer for World Food Programme, based in Rome. And we also have Lisa Delmith, which will come after Andrew Harper, actually. Then we'll have Lisa Delmith first, who's an associate professor and director of PhD studies in international relations at the Department of Economic History and International Relations at Stockholm University. The last but certainly not least, I mentioned Jonathan Porritt as well from WFP. And they will all be given a few minutes as well to set out their thoughts and reactions. And then after that, we'll be opening up for the last couple of minutes, I think 20 minutes actually, for open discussion. So we will really welcome your questions and comments, but you can put your comments in the chat box, I think, which might be disabled. So your questions in the Q&A function. And of course, please, that means that you could upvote questions that you think are particularly interesting and they will help float to the top. So without further ado, Ollie, would you like to present the findings of this report, please?
Bernie, thank you so much. I'm just going to ask Chris to unshare his screen so I can share mine. And thank you so much to everybody for joining us. As Bernie said, it sounds like quite a dry topic, but I actually think it's really, really interesting. This issue around climate risk management in international sphere. And I wanted to just spend literally just 10 minutes just to kind of lay out a little bit about the main findings of this report that we're just publishing. We published yesterday, basically asking about how international organizations are dealing with this. And Andrew, Lisa, and Jonathan are dealing with this on a daily basis as well. So I'm really looking forward to their thoughts on this. And the basic premise that we started with is that we have, a couple of dozen organizations that collectively set the agenda for the world on critical issues, on food, on energy, on development, on security, and so on. And Andrew's from UNHCR and Jonathan's from the World Food Programme. So two of those kind of key agencies that collectively set the kind of global agenda on these issues. But all of these, the vast majority of these agencies, funds and programs were created kind of at a time before we realized what anthropogenic climate change was doing. And so it sort of asks the fundamental question, is the international system that we have to deal with these critical collective action problems of hunger, of poverty, of pandemic disease, of economic contagion. Is it fit for purpose in a world that is +3 degrees, +4 degrees, +5 degrees? And if it's not, what do we need to do to get this kind of collective international safety net in a position where it can actually ensure that, in the words of Dag Hammarskjöld, the second UN Secretary General, that the UN saves us from hell. It's not, that it's kind of fundamental goal. So, and this network has the kind of family of UN agencies has been critical in terms of saving us from a whole series of risks: eradication of smallpox, arms control, improvements in energy, water and food, disaster relief, and so on. But climate change has a whole series of risks for these organizations, both direct risks in terms of floods, droughts and storms, indirect risks, hunger, increased mortality, fragile livelihoods, and systemic risks in terms of instability, mass migration, and so on, that could have really profound implications for the ability of these international organizations to conduct their mission, to deliver the services for which they're designed. And I guess the way we sort of see it is that there's two kind of different types of risks: the kind of external role that these organizations have to set the agenda around explaining the risk to others and providing a decision support system for governments and communities and people around the world to make decisions around how they manage their agricultural system and so on. But also there's an internal dimension for those organizations themselves. So how do they adjust their own strategy and their own operations to be sure that they can still fulfill their mission in a +2, +3, +4 degree world? And then we sort of further break it down and talk about some of the operational risks that organizations face on a daily basis in the field, in terms of floods and droughts and hurricanes and so on, but also some of the strategic risks that potentially fundamentally change the mission that they have in front of them, the demand for their services, and their ability to provide those services. And when you start thinking about climate change as this kind of systemic issue that is kind of non-stationary, is changing, we have tipping points that are unpredictable, we have a whole series of potential kind of cascading risks that can happen around the world, and that it's a regressive risk, so it affects the poor, the most vulnerable most, then you start seeing how this potentially has very significant impacts for organizations, not just at the operational field level, but also at the kind of strategic level of what is their scope to achieve their mission. And so we were looking at this, and we sort of did deep dives and lots of interviews with 24 different UN agencies, funds and programs to understand how they were incorporating approaches to risk and incorporating approaches to climate risk in their work. And now, so obviously one of the important things to say is that the UN faces many different risks the whole time. I mean, that's fundamentally what it's about. And climate change is one of those risks that's interacting with a whole series of others, potentially making them more difficult. Now, there's something called enterprise risk management, which is a sort of systemic, strategic, organization-wide approach to managing risk that was developed in the private sector, several decades ago, has come into government sector, and has now come into the sort of international organizations a little bit later. In 2006, the General Assembly passed a resolution to adopt enterprise risk management across the UN system. And there's been sort of several follow-ups for that, but it's been a kind of slow process to put in place kind of systematized approaches to think about risk, which involves organizations articulating what risk they want to take on, understanding those risks and kind of putting them into a risk register and developing mechanisms to minimize those risks, and also thinking about ways to act and escalate the response to whatever risks there are. And again, Jonathan and Andrew have spent a lot of time thinking about this within UNHCR and WFP. So it's a slow process. It's been developing. And what we wanted to do was look at how international organizations sort of take on board the external risks of climate change and the internal risks. And this is just a very quick summary of, I guess, what we found. And of the organizations we found, pretty much every organization mentions climate change in their strategic planning and in their external policy documents. So the external decision support mechanism for that the international system has is quite strong. It's, you know, every organization is basically saying this is how climate change, it has an impact on the area on which we're working, whether it's UN Women or World Health or the Environment Programme or, you know, International Maritime Organization and so on. So the vast majority include climate change in their strategic planning. But when it comes to indicators on climate change, so actually what are they measuring? So slightly fewer actually include indicators on climate change in their strategic planning. And then a fewer still have enterprise risk management systems. So actually systematically thinking about how they should manage risk. And then within those, a smaller group still have both a publicly available risk register. So saying, these are the issues that we think are important, that then are thinking about publishing what those risks are. And so there's other organizations that have risk registers that aren't publicly available, but you'll see from this sort of family of organizations, there's a kind of you know, descending group that are actually really perhaps taking this on board and being transparent about what risks they see in their own organization. And I guess we would say there are some great examples of really forward-thinking approaches to risk management, of which UNHCR and WFP are some of those. But just as a general point, across what we saw across the international sort of organizations we looked at was, and the people we spoke to, was a kind of generally weak culture of risk management, quite lengthy strategic planning processes that mean that you know, the analysis that develops the strategic plan on which the risk is then developed can be quite out of date by the time the strategic plan is put into place. All of these organizations have member states to keep happy. So you have 196 odd bosses to deal with. So there's a tendency for these kind of politically negotiated strategies that can be quite path dependent. And that, in our view, leads to a tendency to avoid kind of risky interventions, certainly on the part of some of these organizations. So there's a kind of risk aversion among a lot of the international organizations. And that also, in our view, leads often to a kind of hazard by hazard approach to risk management. So dealing with individual risks in isolation of each other, whereas with climate change, there's sort of cascading impacts across different sectors. So that was another thing we thought was quite important, that actually thinking about how those climate impacts cascade is quite significant. Last slide. In terms of improving risk management, I guess we sort of viewed that all of these organizations have a kind of core role to ensure their mission resilience. And this has a few different elements. It's about foresight. It's about working with the countries in which they're operating. It's about ensuring they have operational resilience. They can carry on fulfilling their functions in, you know, despite what climate change might throw at them. And that is sort of driven by peer-to-peer engagement across the international sphere. So I guess the broad point that we would say, the one takeaway, is that we felt that organizations, and this isn't the case for all organizations, but a lot of organizations need to move from being quite reactive to being quite proactive, and thinking about articulating what risks they are willing to take on. Second point, they need to manage those climate risks. 20 seconds, Bernice. Managing climate risk involves incorporating uncertainties in decision-making. And so climate risk assessment should be standard practice. And that many of these under-managed risks come from interdependence. So good scenario planning is important for that. And final point is that institutionalizing this risk management, both within organizations and across the UN, is really important. And so one way of doing that is knowledge sharing. So with that, thank you very much. I shall turn it back to you, Bernice.
Well, thank you very much, Ollie. And now I think that you have given us a lot of food for thought, especially in terms of how do you balance the strategic risks and the day-to-day operational and also hazard by hazard risk, which we obviously have to manage both as well. So to kick us off today, as one of the first panelists is Andrew Harper, as I mentioned, is a special advisor on climate action to the UNHCR in Geneva, responsible for providing strategic guidance, oversight and expertise to shape HCR's climate action agenda. before his current task, he was the director of the Division of Program Support and Management, where he oversaw program policy, planning and management, as well as technical support to field operations. So I think he's in a good space to address some of the challenges that actually Ollie outlined for us. I mean, Andrew, you have worked on many of these issues in the UNHCR, and maybe at a very broad level, having listened to what Ollie's findings had been, what does climate risk mean in UNHCR, and how have you tried to get the organization to change its planning and response? And it's also partly a question that we can dig deeper into as well, that I saw from the Q&A from Coco Warner as well, that we could go to. So you've worked on many of these. What does it mean, climate risk in the UNHCR, and how have you tried to get the organization to change its planning and response?
Well, firstly, thanks. And I would just say that what Ollie and the team have put together in the report, we can only just but fully endorse. And what we're doing in my role as a special advisor for climate action is using the ERM, the enterprise risk management, as a means in which to help guide the organization be exactly what Ollie was saying. We need to be much more anticipatory in how we address the future risks rather than reacting. We need to be involved in discussing with communities on the ground about what is it that they need to mitigate and prepare and adapt. We need to assess who is best placed to do it, because sometimes if we try and take on too much, that we're at risk of institutionally failing. We need to try and ensure that we focus on impact, sustainability in regards to how we approach things, but overall break it down as much as possible into determining what is it that UNHCR should be involved in regards to a series of risks that we've never contemplated or been able to assess in the past. It's not only climate that we also need to take into account when we're looking at risks, it's also how climate is attributing or is an attribution to increasing vulnerability across the board. And so how that links in with food insecurity. So we're obviously talking to FAO and WFP. How does it link in with stress on water resources? How does it, what's going to be the ability of governments to provide basic services? How can they abide and meet their social contracts with their communities? All these things link up into the ability of societies to maintain a degree of stability. And if they're not stable and not being able to move forward in a way which is stable, then you look at fragility, conflict, violence, and displacement. And that's where we come into play. So we're trying to be much more anticipatory, because the science is clear. Like, there's no reason why any of us should be surprised. Ignorance can no longer be an excuse when you've got so much information there. So we've established a sustainable framework for climate action in order to guide UNHCR. We've put forward a legal considerations paper for the protection considerations. We've got a sustainable energy paper as well, linked into a clean energy challenge. We've got some 400 people involved. And we're looking to see how we can work much more effectively with all stakeholders, because the issues, I've still got 10 seconds, all issues that are at play. So collaboration is key to address this challenge. Over.
Well, thank you. I mean, there's a question that I want to ask you that I think maybe we can go to later in the Q&A session, which is obviously the question that it will be not just for you, but for probably Jonathan as well later on, which is that climate change clearly presents a very huge existential challenge for your organization in and of itself, because of the way this may in fact overload your program. So I just want to sort of hear how you see how you can balance sort of the response on a day-to-day level with the sort of systemic response to an existential challenge. I think we will spend more time later on in the Q&A answering this. So I just want to plant this with you really for now, so that we can go back to it, I think, because I would think at this point, since we are dealing with some of the sort of bigger picture challenges, I think it'll be good to go to Lisa Delmuth, who
thank you, Bernice. Yes, exactly. I was going to take more of a helicopter perspective on the international system, if that's okay, to kind of complement Ollie's managerial perspective. I'm a political scientist. I have almost 12 years of experience working on international organizations. and I work specifically on climate change and legitimacy issues. I just wanted to start by saying that this is a really great and important paper, and I really agree that I think that we have about 200 multilateral organizations to date, depending on how you count. And I really agree with Taylor and Ollie that about a dozen of those lead the global work on climate risks. I think it's also interesting that the paper touches on this historical dimension, that organizations have core mandates, many of which originally did not include climate change, but nowadays, as our research shows, engage with climate risks. And we have looked at about 40 major organizations with core mandates in 10 different issue areas, and they all address climate risks for human security. Just to mention a couple of ones that are not mentioned, that are not center stage, at least in Ollie's and Taylor's paper. We also look at development, disaster risk reduction, humanitarian assistance, and regional multi-issue organizations. And many of those actually, like Arctic Council, ASEAN, the EU, Organization of American States, Pacific Island Forum, or African Union. I really think, really appreciate the question of whether the international system is fit for purpose. It's almost so broad that we cannot address it, but I think we can say, and I would like to say something constructive and optimistic about that. But so my take is that I can reflect on 3 factors that I think that we know from research shapes how successfully international organizations can deal with climate risks. COVID-19, geopolitical trends, and the ongoing populist backlash. So to me, geopolitics refers to a system of political practice that pursues territorial interests, and mostly security interests, on the basis of zero-sum logics. And it's not oriented toward multilateral solutions. And I think geopolitics has in recent years accelerated some of the major countries' isolationist and unilateral tendencies. And many of the major countries now place greater emphasis on national risk management than on global coordination. To give just a few examples of how I think that geopolitics matters with international organizations' engagement with climate risks. For example, international trade is essential for food security, but it also creates vulnerabilities in terms of supply disruptions, including those that are politically motivated, and those are at the heart of the mandate of many international organizations. Armed conflict, as we know from research, is one of the main drivers of food insecurity, which can feed into social unrest and violence. And climate change interacts with all of these phenomena, reshapes material flows and the political calculus of actors. And I think geopolitics is part of the reason why international organizations still have to address these complex issues, which actually require a systemic and integrated perspective with limited core funding and mostly short to medium-term project funding. I think this is a really important repercussion. And from academic research, we know relatively little actually about how these geopolitical linkages really affect the engagement and the successful engagement of international organizations with climate risks. And obviously they interact with trends such as COVID-19 and the populist backlash. I saw Bernice's sign, so let me just round up by saying something about legitimacy, which is a core area of my research. We study it as a perception that an institution exercises power appropriately among broader publics and political elites. And actually, despite the ongoing public debate about ours and the populist backlash, recent data shows quite good news for international organizations. The World Values Survey has surveyed citizens in 80 countries worldwide, and we can see that citizens have on average moderate levels of confidence in international organizations. For example, 60% of world citizens report a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the WHO. Almost 50% have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the UN and WTO, a bit over 40% in ICC and the World Bank. And let me say that we have even better news for the political elites. We have surveyed political elites in Brazil, Germany, the Philippines, Russia, South Africa, and the US in a global sample across different types of sectors. So not only political elites, but also media and business, for example. And here we can see that these elites have moderate to strong levels of confidence, although half of them do not deal with international issues in their daily lives. For example, 80% of our survey elites have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the WHO, and almost 70% in the UN, the ICC, and the UNFCCC. So in sum, I think the international system has already good available mechanisms to address climate risks, but I think the governments need to supply more core funding to allow for greater flexibility, to adopt integrated approaches. And our survey data actually suggests that international organizations have both popular and elite support to move forward. Thank you.
Well, I mean, that's great to hear that there is strong public support for doing more. So in your view, what could they be doing more tomorrow?
You mean the international organizations when they engage with climate risks? Yeah, I think that many international organizations have really good communication strategies nowadays. There's very little research on that issue, but I think there's more and more professionalized engagement. There's some engagement with the broader public on social media. I think this is a great opportunity because we don't have a transnational public sphere where citizens across the globe would engage with each other on global issues. So I think IOs would be well advised to engage with the broader public and tell them about all the good things that are going on and all the challenges that are being tackled on new transnational platforms such as social media.
A very interesting idea, because obviously the international organization system is one that comes up with a system of states. But now that we have a direct way to engage, why not use it? That's a very, very specific and I think hopefully helpful suggestion for our interlocutors as well on the panel. Now with that, there are quite a lot of great questions coming through, which we hope to address more later on. Next up, we have Jonathan Howard, who is the Chief Risk Officer for the World Food Programme. Now, you have been dealing with a lot of these questions for a really long time. I mean, again, in the same vein of this kind of question we've been asking everyone, what does it mean from your perspective for WFP? And what are you guys doing about it?
So, well, again, if I can also just start by thanking Ollie for an excellent paper, because I do think you hit the mark and you summarized the issues very well. For WFP, and I think in broader for climate risk management, you're in a long game in terms of culture change. And I think you don't join somewhere to set up risk management and it's going to be different in 3 months. Yeah, it might be, but it's a progression where you look back over 3 years and you say we're quite different. We're organized different and we think differently. And you build, if you like, we sometimes call them in the universities of WFP, and then there's a new generation of people that come through that think and behave and respond differently. So we're in a long game, that's the first point. And there are certain things that have been easier. People accept risk assessment conceptually. They like their risk, I say like, they may not like the task of doing them, but they do like to talk about risks, whether it's in a risk register, a strategic plan, and they like to lay them out. So that's been culturally more easy, but the monitoring can be harder. So capturing some of the data and changing the behavior patterns via the data is a lot of the challenge at times. And therefore the value of information sharing, not just internally and across all the silos, but also across different agencies. We are in common space here in terms of our approaches, what we want to achieve, understanding of longer-term behavioral change in terms of assessing, mitigating, monitoring, correcting, if you are course. We're a super tanker, if you like, in these international institutions, right? You turn the steering wheel and it's this very small tiller at the back that's going to move and you don't want it doing what happened in the Suez Canal either, being blown off course by the wind. So you are playing a long game, and you're, if you like, if I can carry that analogy, steering a very big ship. And we're all in this together, maybe a cliche, but very true. Within WFP, very quickly, there's a strong strategic component because it is a cross-cutting risk. It is a driver of so much of needs of beneficiaries of food security, migration and such. So it drives our programs, and we do have this syndrome. WFP is an emergency response agency, but it's also an agency for changing lives and building resilience. And this is right, climate change is right at the core of our building resilience agenda. So we are in fact in the process of drafting an updated strategic plan, and climate change is at the core of it. It also affects our operations. It may be lots of little things we do, habits around flying, or how we we handle waste or how we organize our premises. Lots of small habitual things, teaching ourselves how to think better and smarter about the climate. And then we set an example. And we ourselves can be climate neutral if we think how to do it. So we have an environmental and social safeguards and sustainability program, not just around our programming, but also around our operations. So a cross-cutting risk, driving so many things for us. And I think stepping back a bit, it was said in Ollie's paper, it's climate risk is a subset of ERM. I'd say, well, ERM is a kind of chapeau that stops people acting just in silos, that gets people sharing across the different silos and thinking common ways. And a cross-cutting risk such as climate change, we cannot look at it down a silo. We have to look at it in everything that we do. And it is a mindset, and it's a cultural mindset. So with that, I'll stop, but thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, because I actually wanted to ask you, since you also chair the UN Risk Management Task Force with the participation and support from about 30 plus agencies, and you also have about 20 years of experience in senior risk roles in financial sector. I mean, what you just talked about just now, in terms of how do we avoid, obviously, risk management being effectively a box-ticking exercise and really come alive and incorporate it into decision making. What do you think we can learn from different sectors when it comes to risk management for that, so that it doesn't just become, you get the risk guy to come in and talk about how much the risk has been managed and then say bye-bye?
So you could overburden people with risk processes. And so I would say be very careful about rolling out a new process, another new survey, another data collection exercise. Be selective, stick on the high ground on it. But yeah, engaging people is the key, making it interactive. And data will drive decision making. I was very pleased in reading not just Ollie's paper, but in fact the references and our internal notes on this. There is a lot of data out there on climate change, and that will drive better behavior and better thinking and congeal people's interaction much better. Yeah, there can be a fatigue. Why are you coming to me with your priority when I'm busy doing this? That's a very human syndrome in large organizations. So ERM can help sit above that, and I think the climate agenda as a cross-cutting issue can also do so. So data, participation, people do like assessment. Sorry to say, and I know it's a cruel thing to say, but they don't like too many audit issues and things that hit them, backward-looking stuff. The corporate stick upon them, punishment as sometimes people, the risk police. We've heard all the cliches, but if you can be forward-looking, data-driven, value-adding, and you can help decisioning, you're relevant. So, and the same things apply in climate risk management.
Well, thank you for that. And this is a good time to turn to one of the questions I see that a couple of people have asked. I think Spencer Robinson is one, and then also there's an anonymous attendee asking, I think, similar kind of questions around how do you make sure that these processes that you described that shouldn't be too lengthy are practical, but are also incorporating a sort of more bottom-up approach, including the voices of the people at grassroots level as well. And obviously engaging with platforms, which are also something that Lisa mentioned as well, would be important. How do you make sure that you can do that in the way you incorporate the thinking and risk management within these organizations that are, as you rightly pointed out, really tankers, super tankers even, certainly not nimble little things?
So I think participation, I mean, we do ask people, actually they did it more than I would have wanted when I first joined, but I'd say at least a year, once a year, look at your major risks and do that at your entity level as well as down your process chain. And that is participatory. Most people have workshops around it. They do a completely bottom-up look at all their risks together. They can compare what they've done before. So the assessment has worked well in terms of interaction, but data is the other piece that will really drive it, because that's objective. You can't just make up, well, some do, but you can't just make up numbers. You'll get caught out if you do that over time. Look at the trends in data, and that will then signal or trigger some kind of response, some kind of escalation. So it's a living process. It's not a dead process. Does it trickle down to the most junior person? Well, it depends. They're just dealing with different levels of risk. I'm sorry to be mundane on it, but there's a lot of risk in being driven from the airport, frankly, in some of the countries that we're at. And so, there's risk management, whether you're a driver or whether you're a technician in a lab. There's an application of the risk policy to everybody.
Yeah, I think this is less about sort of filtering through to the. It is less about filtering through to the most juniors, but more really about how to make sure that you're actually taking grassroots approach as well, so that you're having a mix. I think, Andrew, would you like to comment on that from the UNHCR perspective as well, please?
Yeah, well, I think going back to one of the original points was how we're assessing climate as a risk to the organization and as a protection agency with like tens of millions of people who we've got an accountability for. If you look at the likelihood of climate change and the fact that it's undeniable that it's not only happening, but it's baked in, and the potential severity, like we are seeing it as probably the key risk, not only for the organization's relevance in the future, but for tens of millions of people. Like, we have to grasp the importance of this. And while we can put in guidelines and frameworks and sign up to conventions and policies, it's only when you start implementing it at the ground level does it make a difference to the populations on the ground. And as I mentioned in my opening, the most important aspect when you start to look at anticipating, assessing, acting, it's basically also asking. You need to be able to ask the populations on the ground, including the authorities, to say, how can we get through this? What is it that you want? What is it that you need in order to not only prepare, but also to adapt? And also to identify who's best placed to be most effective in addressing that. Maybe it's not UNHCR. In most cases, it won't be. It will be NGOs. It could be ministries, the national departments. So we have to translate these sometimes fairly lofty statements and frameworks and risk assessments into the ground level. And so as far as UNHCR is concerned, but this is not necessarily only reliant upon UNHCR, we need to be working with others so that there is regional and country plans of action for climate. And that would then ensure that the processes which feed into a global plan of action are developed at the ground level. So for instance, even tomorrow we have a meeting with NGOs for the 3 regional bureaus in Africa, where we're going to be looking at climate action. Last week we had one for Asia and Pacific. The week before that we had one for Middle East and North Africa. So I think we're moving along the right way. What I am missing is that it's not holistic enough, because the challenges that UNHCR are facing are the same ones that probably IOM is facing or WFP is facing. And so why aren't we all getting in a much more strategic approach to addressing what the needs are and aspirations of the communities on the ground? I think that's where it's missing. And how can the UN as a whole take a much stronger leadership on developing plans of action to fit into the national development plans of the governments? Because in the end, that's also where you're going to have a demonstrate impact. And then also, if we're all working together on these collective outcomes, common outcomes, and which are in line with what the communities want, the authorities want, then it's more likely that we're going to be agreeing on what are the questions that we need to have answered, what is the data that we need to have collected. As was said, there's plenty of data out there, but it's usually rubbish, or it's not being shared, or it's not being put in a format that can be easily transferable and analyzed. So we have to be addressing this climate crisis in a way that it's not an individual entity's issue. We have to be looking at this is everyone who's involved, not only on the humanitarian sector, but also on the development sector, peace building and security sector, governance sector. And that's what's missing. We're still, I would dare say, all over the place on that. And the leadership is missing. We're trying to demonstrate that it can be brought together in the Sahel under the leadership of the UN Special Coordinator for Development there, which we're working on a predictive analytics project with academia but we need to be doing much more of this. When I say we, it's everyone who's on this call and listening in. How can we be focused more on impact at scale, grassroots up, as you say, in the future? Over.
Well, thank you for that. And I think that this is now time for us to sort of also switch to some of the sort of very big picture questions that we have been getting from the audience, which I think are excellent questions. I'm going to start with the one that actually came from Kokowana from the beginning, which was really for you again, Andrew, but also for Jonathan, but also obviously Ollie and Lisa, please feel free to chip in as well, which is how would mandates need to change in order to allow ex-ante actions by organizations such as HCR and WFP to allow preempting risk, planning for it, and putting commensurate contingency measures into place as well. I don't know whether, Andrew, you want to keep going, or Jonathan, you want to come in? Andrew, please.
I will go ahead, because people sort of say you need to change a mandate, or you need to have a new, like there needs to be something established for climate refugees. You don't need that. What you need to focus on is why are people having to move in the first place? And again, this is where investing in science, in preparedness, in adaptation, and focusing on vulnerability rather than people moving is going to be so key. And so if you follow through with what I was mentioning before about the need to anticipate, which is what Coco was saying, then we need to, again, ask the population. We need to assess who's best placed to deal with it. We need to act, and we need to hold people accountable. At the moment, almost all those elements are not being properly addressed. There's not sufficient investment in anticipatory planning. There's not sufficient consultation with asking people on the ground. There's not sufficient recognition about who's best placed to address each one of these issues. We're not acting in a way which is at scale, which is timely, and which is focused on impact, and we're not necessarily holding people to account. So each one of those elements can be addressed, and then you've got to start identifying, if we're struggling at the moment, then how are we going to be going if the temperature increases by 2 degrees Celsius and we see sea level rise by 2 to 3 times what had been previously modeled? So this lack of a holistic approach to scenario planning is holding us back from being more effective, and which goes back to the framing of today's question is, are we fit to be able to deal with the risks which climate change is broaching towards us? And I'd say absolutely not. We have to move away from delivery to transforming the system.
Well, I think that's an excellent answer. I also wanted to sort of prompt all our panelists as well. In addition to, I mean, we understood the importance of being holistic and making sure the pieces work together, etc. But I think it'll be good at this stage in the meeting to also give us some examples of how do you make it practically work on a day-to-day level, given all the dynamics that you have also outlined. And there's another excellent question lurking that I'm dying to ask all of you shortly about the balance between power between the agency and the member states. But Ollie, you raised your hand. Would you like to come in, but also with a view to helping us figure out what will be the best way to put this into practice, the kind of vision that Andrew and Jonathan and Lisa and yourself had put forward to make it work better together, predictively, preemptively, ex ante, not just obviously after the fact. Ollie, please.
Yeah, thanks, Bernice. I mean, there's so many different aspects to this. I mean, some of which Jonathan and Andrew are already touching on in terms of, systematic things that each organization can do to sort of change this risk culture. As Jonathan was talking about very, in a very interesting way in terms of what people will accept and how you gather that information and how you make this a part of the way that people do their job. So there's all sorts of things that organizations can do, and lots of really interesting examples that different organizations have done in terms of either having yearly, each country office does a kind of yearly risk plan and starts thinking about it, or you articulate what your risk appetite is. It's a slightly strange phrase, but what are you as an organization willing to risk to deliver your mandate? And obviously that changes depending on those different organizations. To things like, UNDP has started employing futurologists to start thinking about future scenario planning and just getting out of this sort of perhaps old sort of international civil servant approach of you have project managers and analysts and so on, and sort of starting to think a bit more creatively around human resources. And one of the things I would love hear, maybe if I can put him on the spot, from Jonathan, is this really interesting new initiative called the Risk Management Forum, which is set up to actually share some of these things across the UN system, and that Jonathan is actually co-chairing. Again, it's one of these things that provides that mechanism for that kind of peer-to-peer organizational engagement that allows best practices from one place, from UNHCR, to feed through, or wherever it may be, to feed through to other organizations. So those are the things I think that are really important. Back to you, Bernice.
Well, thanks for that. Lisa, would you like to come in as well on this?
Yes, always much better to say something about the nuts and bolts of how this could be operationalized. But at the strategic level, I think it's really important that that engagement with research actors are promoted and kept up. I mean, there are a lot of really great projects being promoted by different UN agencies, and there's a lot of collaboration with climate scientists. A little bit less with social scientists, is my perception. I think it could be good to deepen these relations, because I think part of why international organizations are reluctant to invest more budgets and to address climate risks, and part of why governments may be reluctant chip in with greater resources to address specific climate nexuses at the global level, is because we know relatively little about climate risks, what they mean in different issue areas. For example, in security and migration, we have a lot of scientific uncertainty and relatively great problem complexity. And there, our research also shows least engagement of different organizations with climate risks. By contrast, in the areas of food and development, we see most engagement when compared to other issue areas. And there, maybe we have longer, like already in the 90s, early engagement of international organizations with climate risk. So I think, and somebody in the chat brought also up NGOs, CSOs, and multi-stakeholder partnerships. And I think these are also very important, because non-state actors of all different kinds provide really important research insights, but also as engagement with the deepening engagement with climate and social scientists, I think would be a really good strategy.
Thank you. I mean, Jonathan, I mean, the mandate question was also for you as well, obviously, not just for Andrew. Would you like to comment on the mandate question?
It's very quickly. I mean, the mandate is there. That's not the issue. I would say it's the confidence of stakeholders for us to deliver on particular items of a mandate. So on development work, yes, are we the best agency? Do we have the skills? Do we have the workforce to be able to deliver? We know we're a good emergency responder, but building that strength in development and resilience. So, and I think a very good point was made. We've got to think cross-agency on this stuff. We shouldn't be competing for funding as much as collaborating for funding. And there should be, I think Andrew said, country level cross-agency strategic plans on climate approaches, climate action plans, I think you said. And risk appetite, you have a risk appetite implicitly, whether you like or not. Whether you're going to charging in or stepping back. And institutionally, I think comments are made, sometimes all the consultation that we have to do, all the stakeholder ownership, we become institutionally risk averse. And there has been a push on this to be more decentralized and light-footed in our decision making. But then the risk still needs to join that up in terms of information flows. Good points also on future scenario planning. Who can deny that is so important, the more we can look forwards. Last but not least, on HLCM, the High Level Committee on Risk Management Forum, that's a very long-winded term, but sharing risk approaches and information is part of it. Yes, there's a certain convoy system that we're all moving in the same direction is the main thing, and we're not duplicating. We are sharing, so we're replaying things that work. Just to give one example of an area, we haven't had a separate internal risk management session on climate, but we have done fraud risk management as an area where agencies really need to think together, to have common approaches, and not just at the top, but actually in the field, in each country. We need key contact points to manage fraud better, to manage our supplier networks better, our cooperating partners better, to make sure that fraud and corruption are mitigated. Maybe not a particularly palatable subject sometimes, but a critical one for the UN to be aligned on. And in the same way, climate. We should indeed think commonly across agencies on our approaches, on sharing information, action plans at the top, but also at the field. Yes. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. And I think maybe now is a good time to bring in this question that I think is quite an intriguing question. A couple of intriguing questions here. One is from Nancy Wright. It says that it's actually originally directed at Ollie's presentation, but I think that others would be useful as well to comment. What do you see as the threshold of agency between IGOs as autonomous or semi-autonomous and the dependence on member states? And that of course feed into not just the technical, but also the political question in terms of the political space for both managing, racing, but also tackling some of these risks as well. So Ollie, would you like to come in on that in terms of the threshold?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and perhaps I can be slightly more indiscreet than Andrew and Jonathan can, given that I'm not actually working for an international organization now, so I don't have to be so worried about it. And I was in the UN Environment Programme, and it was constantly, this was one of the big questions, is to what extent does the organization, very small in comparison to WFP and UNHCR, but to what extent does this organization have agency and can do stuff over and above what is set out in the mandate? And we were always very aware that we had 196 bosses to try and keep happy. And they kept a very close eye on us. And we would meet them every 3 months, and they would go over our strategic plans with a fine tooth comb. I guess a couple of things I would say. Certainly the organization itself would always try and be very respectful of that limited agency. It was given a fairly short rein, but within that would then try and sort of innovate and maybe sort of make some, go to the boundaries of what was allowed by the member states. And the other thing to say is that with 196 bosses, they don't always say the same thing at the same time, as I'm sure Andrew and Jonathan know. And so you will get very different messages depending on who you're speaking to. And that certainly gives us quite a lot of wiggle room to different agencies to selectively listen to some and not listen to others. And there are various points in the calendar at which there is a definitive agreement by consensus on a new mandate or on a resolution or whatever it might be. But there's certainly, in the organizations I've been in, there's a certain amount of wiggle room around that, depending on whether you're listening to mum or dad, basically, of your different bosses. Back to you, Bernice.
Thanks. I mean, I'm just wondering, does Andrew and Jonathan want to have an inside view on this question about balancing between your mandate and obviously.
Yeah. Okay. I'll shoot ahead, mainly because the whole issue of climate refugees and UNHCR's involvement on cross-border displacement of people displaced due to disasters and natural hazards is always been a quite contentious issue. But what we have been able to find, and this is where we've been involved with research and academics and looking at evidence, is to say that we're already involved with climate-induced displacement because 90% of the world's refugees already originate from countries that are on the front lines of the climate emergency, that they least adapt, that got the least capacity to adapt to climate change. So for decades, we've already probably been dealing with people displaced by a combination of climate and conflict. It's just that it's happening more and more, and there's greater profile for it. On the positive side, every agency is always alert to the sensitivities of member states, but also other agencies. But what I've found, particularly over the last 18 months, is that a lot of the sensitivities have become lessened and the desire to collaborate has increased. And so, for instance, with WFP or with IOM or UNDP or UNEP or NGOs, we're all starting to get it that this is an existential crisis. Like the world in 10 years' time is not going to be the world that we're facing with now. And we have to be looking at what are the collective outcomes that we're after? How can we reduce suffering? How can we be less focused on ourselves? Maybe I'm idealistic about this, but we can't continue the way in which we've worked in the past 60 or 70 years. We have to transform the system in a way which we look at who is best placed to deliver and make a difference. And hopefully it's the people on the ground. Hopefully we can work better with the private sector and with national authorities, because that's the only way which it can probably be sustainable. But I look at the climate crisis as being a driver not only of vulnerability, but of enhancing collaboration and of relevance of the UN. Over.
Thank you. Jonathan, you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, very little to add, except Andrew's last point is spot on. If we don't come together on this, what can we? I think that we all know it as agencies that we are in a position to compete for funding from major donors. And one donor once asked us, well, what would it take for you to refuse funding from us? To say, we are not the best people to do that. You need to talk to somebody else. Or indeed to say, we want to do this together with. And I think that is the spirit that we need to approach climate risk management on. We cannot operate in a siloed approach as a group of separate agencies in a sort of competitive environment where there's a zero-sum game. And I know certainly between UNHCR and ourselves, we're two large field-based agencies, and we know that collaboration has to work. In the refugee camps, people need feeding, obviously, so that is a natural thing, but it's not always natural in resilience building and the work around climate change.
Well, thanks for that. I just think that now that we are coming to the last, say, 5 minutes, and I'll leave myself a minute at the end to sum up with some of my conclusions, but I wonder whether or not I can invite the panelists as well. You have all seen the questions, so you know what the room wants to know from you. Whether or not I can rely on you to be disciplined and give me like a 45 seconds each summary that you want to leave the audience with today. And in fact, what I might do is I might start actually myself, which is that what we're hearing from all of you today is obviously not in some ways an easy picture to convey, that amidst all the complexities around risk management, we kind of know that a couple of things need to be done. We know that we need to be more honest about boundaries and competencies, making sure that you're connecting both internally and externally, up as well as down, then assuming up is mummy and daddy that Ollie described as the member states, your bosses, 194 plus of them, and down are as equally up the grassroots and all the population that your institutions are trying to serve at the same time. So we kind of know that being holistic and yet specific at the same time is actually extremely important in moving forward. And what we're hearing is this: there is a way to get out of this navigation if we are honest and serious about the risk, especially the boundaries of and competence of delivery too. So that's what I've heard from all of you. So now you have your 30 to 45 seconds to summarize. So I'm going to start with, why don't I start with Jonathan?
I'm busy with the chat open, reading all the chat lines. Well, I mean, maybe there's something I didn't answer well, which is this bottom-up approach. I did talk about engagement on risk management, but I think we all know it. There's been a mismatch between those that have been potentially causing climate change and those who have been suffering because of it. And if you talk to somebody who is starving and about to get their next meal, and you talk about climate change, it's not going to land in the same way, but they are the ones who are suffering from the actions of those who have been doing, frankly, the polluting and the global warming. So I think connecting those two camps together is so much of what we're about. The understanding, yes, in the developed world, but also in the emerging world, that they are indeed the victims of this.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. Andrew, 40 seconds.
I don't think we've got any choice in regards to working more closely together. And as we move forward, there's going to be an increased expectation that we have to, not only from stakeholders, whether it be member states, but also communities. Plus, it's the right thing to do. Because what is coming down the line is so horrific that if we don't lift our game, if we don't transform the way in which we work, we'll be made irrelevant, and others will take on that role, whether that be states, private sector, or whoever. We have got an obligation to reduce the level of vulnerability wherever we can. I think WFP is doing a great thing by moving away from delivery to looking at livelihoods. That's what we've got to do. We've got to focus on dignity rather than reacting to the suffering. Over.
Thank you. That's very helpful too. That it is about reducing vulnerability, and also the risk management approach can improve delivery. Lisa.
Thanks, Bernice. I'd like to take up the question of the panel as a whole. Is the international system equipped to address climate risks? And it also speaks to the other question in the chat about our international organization autonomy. I think that state oversight and auditing is obviously really important, but I think also that states need to step up their core funding, because only more reliable budgets and will enable the planning that enables to increase cooperation across international organizations and across the UN agencies and also to coordinate this cooperation on climate change, this more systemic and holistic perspective on climate change, so that there is no harmful competition over global resources or competition on the ground, actually, which we see to some extent today. So that's something I would like to play the ball into the court of the governments.
Excellent, exactly. It is also where many of the responsibilities have to be shouldered to ultimately. Ollie, please, you have the final word.
20 seconds just to pick up on what Anushka was saying. She's talking about sort of climate refugees. Regardless of the definitional issues, it's a good example of what that means for the international community. You know, some of the predictions are 200 million people displaced as a result of climate change by 2050, you know, within our lifetimes. I mean, that's significant change in the demands on the international organizations, and also has questions for how those people are supported through UNHCR, through IOM, through national governments, and so on. So it's a sort of good example of perhaps some of the challenges that are coming down the pipe. And thank you so much to the panelists for sharing their ideas on that. Back to you.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, obviously there are questions that we didn't get to, but I mean, again, I'm assuming that in this online platform, one good thing is that everyone knows what the questions are. So even though they may not be answered here, then those ideas are shared in any event in a much more osmosis kind of way than perhaps in a personal interaction that more limited by space would be. But what we do know, what we have heard today, is that there are huge challenges facing international organizations, as do all of our respective institutions, as a result of climate change. And therefore asking these fundamental questions about whether or not institutional design, internally, externally, are fit for purpose is the question that we need to equip ourselves with. Not just the answers of today, but also answers from tomorrow as well as we move forward. And with that, we have a very rich discussion today from a combination of practitioners and thinkers. And therefore, I feel that you are helping us all think better, since we all, in some sense, are owners of the international system in our different ways through the countries in which we live, through the organizations and work that we do. I feel like that this is helping us think through some of the fundamental questions around risk management, but also looking forward, how do we prepare ourselves better to make sure that we're more fit for purpose. So with that, I apologize for taking you 3 minutes into the Germany-England game, which we may age us a little bit for this podcast, which I have a feeling we might have lost a few people as a result of that. And I didn't think we did too badly, that we might have only lost about a dozen or so to the England-Germany match. I understand is starting at 5 or so in the UK. So with that, thank you all for joining us today. As mentioned, this is not a simple, easy topic, and I think that our panelists have managed to enlighten us in terms of how best to approach these complex questions in a practical, specific, but also strategic way. So with that, I thank you all for joining us today. I mean, if you were here, you would be joining me in clapping. If not, then good luck, and please join us in other events in the London Climate Action Week as well. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much.